Hey, church family. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe. Certainly good to be with you again on this Wednesday afternoon slash evening or whenever it is that you're watching this, just to get together for a little bit of Bible study and devotional time and hopefully grow together and grow in our knowledge of Jesus and what he's called us to. And if you've been with us on Sunday mornings for the last several weeks, we've been in a series through the book of James, walking through the book of James, talking about a faith that works in the real world. And this past Sunday, we spent some time in James chapter 4. At the end of chapter 4, we actually also went into chapter 5 a little bit, but spent the bulk of our time in James chapter 4. And there were a couple of things that I didn't really get to get into as much and really dive into as much. So I thought we'd take some time this afternoon to really dive into that. Spend a little bit of time, just a few thoughts. And so we'll read the passage first, what James says at the end of James chapter 4, and then I'll give you a few quick thoughts. So, James chapter 4, starting in verse 13. James writes, "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." Life is short. You hear that phrase all the time, right? Even despite all of our Western attempts to look young and stay young and never grow up like Peter Pan, right? And despite our over-realized sense of national invincibility, we still hear that phrase, life is short. And certainly the ticking clock and the graying hair and the growing children and the changing times all remind us of that reality, that our lives are blinkingly brief. One mention of your favorite high school CD around a group of middle schoolers reveals just how much times have changed, and not necessarily because they don't know the band, but because they have no idea what a CD is, right? Someone once said, and I like this quote, and I think it's apropos and very true: the days are long, but the years are short. And as a Christian community, we have no shortage of books and sermons and mottos and mantras declaring exactly that lesson, that life is temporary, life is short, because the reality is that Scripture teaches that truth, and experience echoes that reality, and urgency requires its recognition. And it serves as kind of a grounding indicative for all kinds of urgent imperatives like life is short, make it count. Life is short, enjoy every minute. Life is short, don't waste it. And many others that follow suit. But there is a slight problem with that thinking. And the problem isn't that any of the preceding urgings are wrong-headed or unscriptural. The problem isn't that as Christians we're constantly being reminded not to waste our lives, because it's good to be reminded of that. The problem isn't even with the connection we typically make between the brevity of life and the call to urgency and purpose and focus and diligence. Those are all scriptural and they're all needed. The problem is that when Scripture talks explicitly about the brevity of life and about us coming to that reality, the first thing it talks about is not some ambitious call to action. Now, I'm not saying, and Scripture wouldn't say this either, that we're not called to action at some point, but that's not the first response. Listen again to James's almost melancholic words from verse 15. He says, "What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Now, when you read that, as Americans and as Christian Americans, how would you expect James to follow that statement up? Well, probably with something like those imperatives that I mentioned earlier. Life is short, make it count. Life is short, enjoy every minute. Life is short, don't waste it. Why? Because we are by nature a people who can't help but do. We hear something like life is short, and our immediate application is do better, work harder, sacrifice more, something along those lines. Whether pleasure or service or mission, we remember that life is short and we instantly think act. Now, that's all fine and good and sometimes even scriptural, but it's worth reminding ourselves that in James chapter 4, in that passage that we just read, James is rebuking presumptuous businessmen who are declaring precisely what we usually begin to declare in our hearts when we're hit with the life is short reminder. Life is short, I better start doing fill in the blank. Life is short, I better not waste my opportunity to fill in the blank. Life is short, I'm going to step it up and do fill in the blank. But what does James actually say? He says, your life is a vapor. Therefore, stop making ambitious declarations about what you're going to do and instead acknowledge that God is sovereign. Acknowledge that He's the one in control. Wake up from your arrogance and remember only with His explicit blessing are you going to do anything, much less do what you're so confidently planning to do. Why, you don't even control tomorrow. You don't even control today. Even the declaration that I'm not going to waste my life can kind of be arrogant boasting, as James says in verse 16. Why? Because you don't even know what tomorrow will bring. You don't even know if tomorrow will come. My virtuous resolution that I'm going to maximize my life could actually be an invirtuous presumption that I have a life to maximize. Instead, James says, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. My point is simply this. The presumptuous declaration of what we will ambitiously do with our own life is the exact mentality that God is rebuking when He says through James, your life is short. It's but a vapor, a mist, a fog that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Meanwhile, what is James's exhortation? Your life is short, so make the most of it? Not exactly. More like, your life is short, so humble yourself before God. That's the first response. And by the way, the most important one. And then your actions will flow from there. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.